The wind cut through the bay like a blade, sending waves slamming against the stone walls of the San Francisco marina. Inside the city's gilded conference hall, the world's elite had gathered, politicians, CEOs, diplomats, and a few chosen voices from the global south. Among them, standing tall with his beret casting a shadow over sharp eyes, was Captain Ibrahim Traoré. He wasn't on the guest list. California Governor Gavin Newsom paced backstage, his team flustered. He wasn't cleared by the committee, one aide hissed. "I don't care," Newsom snapped. "He's not going on that stage. This isn't his place." But Traoré had already taken his seat on the front row. The theme of the summit was global resilience and shared leadership. The irony wasn't lost on him. When Newsom finally took the stage, his speech was polished, his teeth whiter than truth. He spoke of innovation, climate leadership, human rights, and American stewardship. He said Africa 3 times, once as a market, once as a challenge, and once as a charity case. That was enough. Traoré rose. Without being called, without waiting for applause. Without fear, the hall went silent. "I wasn't invited," he began, his voice deep, steady. "Because I'm not here to flatter anyone." Newsom took a step forward. "Excuse me, Captain. This isn't your place." Traoré didn't blink. He tilted his head slightly, then smiled, not kindly. "Then why are you shaking?" The pause that followed wasn't just awkward. It was seismic. Eyes darted between them. Phones rose. Cameras clicked. Newsom tried to recover. "You're out of line." "No," Traoré said. "I'm just not in yours." And just like that, the tone of the summit shifted. The governor's polished posture looked suddenly forced. The African captain's raw defiance stole every spotlight. And in that moment, without guns or flags, the balance of power cracked. The silence after Traoré's reply was so profound, even the air seemed unsure whether to move. Newsom's lips parted, but no words came. A man who ruled press conferences with ease, who never hesitated before a camera, now stood as if someone had yanked the script from his hands, and set it on fire. Traoré turned fully to the crowd. His gaze wasn't casual, it was commanding. "For too long," he said, "Africans have been spoken about, spoken for, and spoken over. But never to." The audience, a sea of suits and smug certainty, shifted uncomfortably. Some of them began to realize they weren't witnessing a disruption. They were witnessing a reckoning. Newsom gestured toward security, but none moved. No one dared be the first to touch a man who looked carved from revolution itself. A war veteran, a liberator, a symbol of something too powerful for protocols. "You say this isn't my place," Traoré continued, "but what you really mean is, truth isn't welcome here." Newsom found his voice, but not his strength. "This forum is about unity." "Unity?" Traoré repeated, with a half-smile. "Then why is the West always at the head of the table? Why do your banks drain our minerals while your media paints us as broken?" The screen behind him flickered. Footage, real, raw, damning, filled it. Drones in Africa. Cobalt mines guarded by private militias. Children carrying loads that built your smartphones. No one had prepared for this. And that was the point. Traoré's voice cut through the hush like thunder. "Africa doesn't need another lecture. It needs the mic. And if you won't pass it, then we'll take it." The audience didn't clap, but they didn't look away either. Newsom, cornered, blurted, "You're here to provoke." "No," Traoré said. "I'm here to remind you that your silence is violence, and I'm not afraid of your discomfort." And suddenly, Gavin Newsom, the man who'd once ruled California with camera-ready confidence, looked very small beneath the lights. The chamber lights dimmed slightly, as if reality itself leaned closer to hear what came next. Gavin Newsom straightened his blazer, determined to regain control. "This isn't about Africa," he said. "It's about global stability, order, civilization." Traoré blinked slowly, the kind of stare that isn't confused, but insulted. "Order," he repeated. "Like the order you dropped on Baghdad? Like the civilization you brought to Libya, with bombs?" His tone didn't rise. It dropped, like a blade descending in judgment. The diplomats in the hall shifted again, but now they weren't simply uncomfortable. They were listening. Traoré didn't posture. He didn't scream. He exposed, with precision, not passion. You speak of global order, he said, but what you mean is your order. An arrangement where your corporations take and our children die. Where your flags fly over our oil fields. Where peace only comes after obedience. Newsom tried to interrupt, but Traoré cut him off with the same authority he'd use on a battlefield. You want Africans to wait for permission to speak? No more. We're not guests at this table, we're the ones who built it. A low murmur rose from the back of the chamber. Cameras zoomed, microphones adjusted. Even the American delegates began whispering among themselves. Was this just political theater, or the start of a shift? Newsom grasped for higher ground. America has done more for Africa than any other country, he declared. Aid, medicine, development. Traoré didn't even smile. Aid, he echoed. You give us crumbs from the empire's banquet and expect gratitude. Your aid is bandages after you've broken the bones. Development funded by debt. Medicine priced in suffering. He stepped forward, close enough now that even Newsom had to glance up. You want order? Traoré said, voice like cold steel. Then stop treating Africa like a problem to be managed. Start treating us like people you cannot control. The chamber fell into full silence. Not because they feared Traoré, but because, for the first time, they feared what he represented. Newsom's mouth opened, but nothing came out. He blinked once, then again, as if recalibrating. For a man used to commanding rooms with polish and platitudes, he now stood disarmed, staring into the raw defiance of a soldier who didn't play by diplomatic scripts. Traoré took a slow breath. Not dramatic, controlled. You talk of democracy, yet support dictators who sell their people's futures to Western bidders, he said. You speak of human rights while your drones bury wedding parties in the desert. Someone in the chamber gasped. It wasn't exaggeration. It was memory. Newsom tried again. This isn't productive. It is, Traoré said, not raising his voice. Because the world must decide, are we equals or are we slaves in suits? He turned away from Newsom, scanning the hall. You invited me here not because you respect Africa, but because you fear what's coming. A continent waking up, a people no longer apologizing for standing. Cameras clicked like insects. Some delegates checked their notes, others froze, caught between their governments and their consciences. In Burkina Faso, Traoré continued, we were told our gold had to be sold in Paris, our policy had to be approved in Brussels, our security guaranteed by Washington. But none of those places bled for us. None died for us. We did that ourselves. Newsom muttered something under his breath. Traoré heard it. What was that? He asked, locking eyes again. Newsom, flushed now, replied, your people will pay for this arrogance. That's when Traoré stepped forward, calmly, like a general surveying a silent battlefield. You mistake clarity for arrogance. And you mistake my people for your victims. His voice dropped, heavy as stone. You think power is about bombs and banks. But real power is when the oppressed rise, and speak without fear. Look around, Mr. Newsom. That fear you feel? That's not about me. That's about the end of your illusion. The lights in the chamber didn't change, but everything felt darker for those still clinging to the old world. The room, once a theater for rehearsed speeches and quiet lobbying, had become a crucible. Every delegate now felt the heat, not from lights or politics, but from something primal, the truth that Traoré carried like a loaded weapon. He wasn't there to negotiate. He was there to expose. Newsom sat back down without being told. Not defeated, yet, but shaken. The aura he wore like a tailored suit had frayed, thread by thread, unraveling under the weight of a gaze he couldn't deflect. Traoré didn't gloat. He didn't need to. I didn't come here for applause, he said, or permission. I came to tell you that Africa's days of silence are over. He reached into his jacket pocket, not for a script, not for prepared remarks, but for a folded photo. He held it up, a grainy image of a child in Gaza, lifeless in the arms of a weeping mother. The timestamp was last week. Your allies bomb children, he said coldly. And you fund it. A gasp swept the room, then whispers, some shocked, others angry, some ashamed. Newsom tried to wave it off. That's out of context. No, Traoré interrupted. It is the context. You call for law and order, yet you write laws that keep us poor, and order that keeps you rich. He looked directly at the UN Secretary-General. Where is the resolution for these murders? Where is the tribunal for these war crimes? No one answered. And in that silence, the world began to shift, if only slightly. Journalists scribbled faster. Delegates side-eyed each other with suspicion. A few even stood, quietly, walking to Traoré's side. Cameroon. Bolivia. Yemen. Even a senator from Ireland. Newsom stood too, trying to retake control. You're here because we allowed it. Traoré didn't even flinch. No, he said, I'm here because you can't stop it anymore. And with that, the illusion cracked. What once was a room ruled by fear and protocol had just met a man immune to both. The cameras had been rolling from the beginning, but now they moved. Slowly at first, then decisively. Networks that once centered Western leaders in every frame began reframing their shots. Every lens now pointed toward Traoré. Something seismic was happening, and the world knew it. Pam Bondi, seated behind Newsom, leaned toward him and whispered, "He's hijacking the floor." Newsom didn't answer. His jaw was locked, his hands gripping the armrests like a man trying to hold on to power with his fingernails. Meanwhile, Traoré kept his composure, no shouting, no theatrics. Just the calm of a man who knew he had already won a battle others hadn't even realized had begun. You speak of world order, he said, scanning the chamber, but it looks more like a pyramid. One built on the backs of the many, to serve the few. He pointed to the flags lining the Great Hall. Each of these represents a people, a history, a sacrifice. And yet some are treated like symbols. Others, like warnings. His eyes locked on the American delegation. You built your empire with bullets and loans. Then blamed us when the wounds never healed. A murmur swept through the floor, not quite applause, but not disapproval either. Some heads nodded. Others shifted uncomfortably. Newsom, desperate to regain footing, stood again. Let's not forget, he declared, that the U.S. has helped Africa. Aid, investment, peacekeeping. Traoré didn't wait. You don't help a man while kneeling on his neck. Silence. Even the translators in their glass booths paused, their eyes wide, uncertain if they had misheard. They hadn't. Every loan came with chains. Every gift with a price. You didn't build partnerships, you built prisons. This time, the murmur was applause. Not loud. Not unanimous. But undeniable. Delegates from Latin America, Southeast Asia, and even parts of Europe began nodding. A few clapped softly, unsure if they should, but sure they wanted to. Traoré didn't smile. He didn't need to. This wasn't about performance. It was a reckoning. And the world had just started listening. The shift wasn't loud, but it was thunderous in meaning. You could feel it in the way the posture of diplomats changed. Their pens, once scribbling notes from the US and EU tables, now hovered mid-air. Their eyes, once drifting toward Western power brokers for cues, now remained locked on Ibrahim Traoré like students at the feet of a teacher who finally told the truth. Traoré took a step forward. Not toward Newsom, but toward the center of the hall, toward the symbolic heart of the international order. You thought fear would keep us silent, he said. But fear taught us how to speak louder. He paused. You feared what Africa might become if it remembered who it was. Newsom stood again, desperate now. You're dividing this room with rhetoric and bitterness. No, Traoré shot back. I'm dividing truth from performance. He raised his voice, not in volume, but in gravity. Every time we ask for sovereignty, you call it instability. Every time we seek partnership, you offer puppets. And every time we resist your grip, you call it a threat to order. He turned to the hall. Ask yourselves, whose order? The hall quieted into a hum of breath and reflection. Delegates from Ethiopia and Colombia leaned in. Even the German ambassador, stoic and unreadable until now, scratched a note on his pad that read simply, "Historic moment." Then, Traoré faced Newsom again, not as a man confronting an enemy, but as a mirror held up to the old world. "You said I don't belong here," he whispered, repeating Newsom's earlier outburst. "But I didn't come to belong. I came to remind you that your belonging was never questioned, even when your hands built empires out of ashes." Newsom's throat worked. No words came. And then the final blow. "You built the table, yes. But you didn't build it for all. And when we pull up our own chairs, you panic." In that moment, no one was cheering. No one dared. It was too solemn, too naked with truth. But the room had turned. And Gavin Newsom, governor of a superpower state, speaker of polished speeches, had become the quietest man in it. Traoré didn't return to his seat. He remained in the middle of the floor, no longer a guest in the room, but the gravitational center of it. And then, something unexpected happened. A voice from the African Union delegate row spoke. "Let him finish." Then another, from the South American bloc. Finally, someone speaks without a leash. A representative from Indonesia, quiet until now, rose and said, "This chamber has long echoed with the voices of power. Today, it echoes with justice." Newsom scanned the room, stunned. What he thought was a solo confrontation had become a reckoning. One man's defiance had opened a floodgate. Traoré turned, his eyes sweeping across the assembly. "You call this the international community," he said, "but what you built was a gated circle. Guarded not by laws, but by fear, debt, and bombs dropped under the name of freedom." He pointed, not at Newsom, not at any one figure, but at the flags lining the ceiling. "History is not asleep," he said. "It watches. And it waits for those who refuse to pretend anymore." The U.S. ambassador tried to interject. "With all due respect, President Traoré." He raised a hand. "Not to silence, but to remind. I've read your memos. I've seen the red lines drawn over African lands, over Middle Eastern skies. You fear chaos, but you export it. You speak of peace, but you fund war. You talk of equality, yet demand obedience." He let the words hang like thunderclouds. Newsom's aides whispered urgently behind him, but he sat frozen. Not out of fear, but out of realization, this wasn't just a clash. This was a shift. And he was on the wrong side of it. Traoré closed this round with one line, sharp and final. "You taught us democracy, but never let us speak. Now we speak, with no permission needed." The room didn't cheer. It stood. One by one. Nation by nation. Not for applause. But for acknowledgement. And Gavin Newsom, mouth slightly open, pride drained, realized he hadn't just lost an argument. He had witnessed a transfer of moral authority. The cameras didn't catch it all, some had already cut away, others fumbled with what narrative to follow. But the world was already watching through 1,000 lenses that didn't belong to mainstream media. The moment had escaped their control. Newsom sat back in his chair, his hands clasped, eyes scanning the room like a man stranded in a battlefield that once looked like home. And in front of him, Traoré didn't gloat. He didn't smile. He simply stood with the bearing of a man who never needed a podium to command attention. A new voice entered the mix, this time from the German envoy. "Mr. Newsom," she said, "if this assembly is only open to those who parrot power, then perhaps none of us belong." The delegate from Brazil nodded. "Maybe that's why so few still believe in this council. Because the truth never had a seat." Newsom's jaw clenched. "You think this man represents truth?" Traoré turned toward him. "No, Gavin. I live what you call truth. And I've buried children who died in its name." The silence was now weaponized. The type that made men squirm. "You lecture the world from golden rooms," Traoré continued, "while your drones turn homes into ash. You export democracy on the wings of warplanes. And when we rise, when we finally speak, you call it chaos." He stepped forward, not as an act of aggression, but with the calm of inevitability. "I am not chaos. I am the answer to your silence." Newsom rose, finally, his voice breaking. "Then what do you want from us?" Traoré didn't flinch. "Nothing. You've taken enough." Then he turned back to the assembly. "But if you truly believe in peace, then it begins by no longer funding destruction. It begins when your leaders stand trial, not only in history books, but before real justice." A hush again. But this time, it didn't feel like the end of a speech. It felt like the opening of a trial. Not one in The Hague, but in the conscience of every nation listening. After Traoré's final words, the room remained still, like a battlefield just before the storm breaks again. But there was no need for thunder. The truth had already struck, and its echo was now rolling across continents. In California, protests sparked outside the Capitol building. Not just African diasporas, but young Americans, veterans, students, and mothers who had lost sons to wars they never understood. They held signs that read, "If Traoré doesn't belong, none of us do." In Lagos, a child watched Traoré's speech through a cracked television screen powered by a makeshift solar panel. His mother turned to him and whispered, "Remember this voice. That is what a leader sounds like." In Ankara, Doha, and Cape Town, leaders met behind closed doors, not to plot, but to prepare. The world was changing, and they knew it would no longer revolve around Washington, London, or Tel Aviv. And in Paris, a reporter tried to ask Macron about Traoré's accusations. The French president, visibly cornered, replied, "Let's not rewrite history," and walked off the stage. But history was already being rewritten. Back in the assembly hall, Newsom had left. His chair sat vacant, abandoned mid-session. It would become a symbol on social media, the empty throne of the old world, they called it. Traoré remained standing, his hands folded behind his back. He had not declared war. He had not made threats. He had done something more dangerous, he had told the truth in a place built to bury it. A young intern approached him afterward, timid. "Sir, how did you stay calm, when they tried to humiliate you?" Traoré looked down at her, a small smile in his eyes. "Because I am not here to be accepted," he said. "I am here to end the illusion." And with that, he walked out, not just from the hall, but into a world that was finally, painfully, listening.